4 months have passed since the release of AMD's extremely impressive Ryzen 7 9800X3D, and it seems the market still can't get enough of that thing. Supply's been reasonable, but it's the demand that has been incredible, and because it's yet another highly in-demand product that's using the same TSMC N4 process, unfortunately the 9800X3D is fighting supply with countless other in-demand products. As a result, even today, the 9800X3D is often out of stock, though at the time of making this video, Newegg.com does have stock and is selling them for $480 US, but they also note that the 9800X3D is their #1 best-selling CPU. Now, the reason for this extreme popularity is pretty simple. The 9800X3D is the world's fastest gaming processor, without exception. And at $480 US, it is very affordable when compared to even the most basic graphics card. The only issue with the 9800X3D is that it's not particularly impressive for productivity workloads. So for those who want to work and play, parts such as the older 7950X3D or the Core Ultra 9285K have been better choices. But today, that changes with the release of the 9950X3D, along with its sidekick, the 9900X3D. The 9950X3D is a 16-core, 32-thread Zen 4-based processor featuring two 8-core CCDs, and one of them has been armed with AMD's 3D V-Cache technology, and it's set to cost $700 US, the exact same MSRP as the previous generation 7950X3D. The 12-core, 24-thread 9900X3D is set to cost $600 US, so again the same MSRP as the previous generation version. Now, I have heard that the initial supply of these new parts is quite good, particularly for high-end CPUs, but as was the case with the 9800X3D, I can't imagine there's going to be anywhere near enough supply to meet the demand, so getting your hands on one is no doubt going to be quite tricky, at least within the next month or so. AMD's only sent out the 9950X3D for review, and frankly that's the only part that really makes sense here for a few reasons. Firstly, the 9900X3D is just 16% cheaper than the 9950X3D, yet it packs 25% fewer cores, so right away, that's not a great deal. But worse still, just 6 cores have direct access to the larger 3D V-Cache, making the 9900X3D less effective for gamers, in a sense that it's essentially an expensive 6-core processor. So in my opinion, unless offered at a 30% discount relative to the 9950X3D, it's not even worth considering the 9900X3D, and this is ultimately why AMD has opted to avoid sending this part out for review. You might also find it a bit strange that we're only getting these Zen 4 dual CCD 3D V-Cache enabled parts now, some 4 months after the release of the 9800X3D. It's possible supply has played a role here, but it could also be the fact that AMD has worked on improving the scheduling for their dual CCD processors to avoid the 9950X3D running into situations in games where it's miles behind the 9800X3D. And this is because the wrong CCD would be used, or too much cross-CCD communication is occurring. Helping to improve this problem, and hopefully solving it, AMD has updated their provisioning packages services and 3D V-Cache performance optimizer, and along with those updates, they're also implementing an application compatibility database. The provisioning packages services is quite a big deal, as it should mean you no longer have to reinstall Windows in order for your new Ryzen processor to work correctly, though AMD does still recommend a fresh install anyway. The service monitors the processor, and if it detects a change in CPU name, core count, logical processor count, or L3 cache amount, it will automatically uninstall and then reinstall. The service is designed to optimize CPU power and performance of dual CCD processors when gaming, like the 9950X3D, and it does this using a combination of power and frequency optimization, along with core parking when using the Windows Game Mode power profile. Now, these optimizations may be dynamically applied to specific power profiles, typically when an application is launched. When the operating system detects that the user is playing a game, it parks the cores on the non-3D V-Cache enabled CCD, making those cores temporarily unavailable to the OS. Then there's the AMD 3D V-Cache Performance Optimizer. This improves the performance of Ryzen 9 3D V-Cache enabled processors for both gaming and non-gaming tasks by dynamically changing the favored processor cores based on the application you're running. When playing a game, for example, the operating system favours the cores connected to the larger L3 cache, and then conversely, when not gaming, it favours the cores with the highest frequency. It's also worth noting that this software doesn't park cores. Finally, there's the brand new AMD Application Compatibility Database, which requires both a new BIOS and a chipset driver. The compatibility database is designed to tackle problematic games that can't be fully addressed by the AMD Provisioning Packages service, and it will support all dual CCD models. Currently, the database includes optimizations for games such as Deus Ex Mankind Divided, Dying Light 2, Far Cry 6, Metro Exodus, Total War 3 Kingdoms, Total War Warhammer 3, and Wolfenstein Youngblood. So a lot of effort has gone into ensuring that when it comes to gaming, the 9950X 3D should be every bit as fast as the 9800X 3D. So I look forward to seeing if that's indeed the case with the 12 games we use for our testing in day one reviews. And then later, I'd like to explore this with a 40 to 50 game benchmark, but that'll be something for the future. For now, let's go over the data that we do have. First up, let's take a look at how the 9950X 3D behaves out of the box with nothing more than the Expo settings applied. After half an hour of looping the Cinebench multi-core test, we recorded an average core clock frequency of 5085 MHz and a peak CPU temperature of 84 degrees. These results were recorded in an ATX case using a 360mm AIO. For enabling PBO, I did this manually in the BIOS, and I've also benchmarked this configuration, which you'll see in the following graphs. Using the advanced PBO options, the PPT, TDC, and EDC were all manually maxed out. The PBO scaler was set to 10 times, the boost clock override was set to plus 200 MHz, and the curve optimizer was set to negative 20. Under these conditions, I saw an average clock frequency of 5227 MHz, so a mere 3% frequency increase over stock. However, because we're using a negative curve optimizer, the peak CPU temperature dropped from 84 degrees to just 78 degrees, and this is because the average package power dropped from 193 watts down to 186 watts. Finally, I've also benchmarked the 9950X 3D using the Eco mode, and this slashed the all-core frequency by almost 30%, down to 3633 MHz, and as a result, we saw a peak CPU temperature of just 61 degrees with a package power of just 88 watts. Okay, time for the Cinebench multi-core performance, and out of the box, the 9950X 3D is good for 2,448 points, making it 4% faster than the standard 9950X in our testing. Though to be fully transparent, I haven't had a chance to update all of my data, so the 9950X data hasn't been updated using the latest chipset drivers. So keep that in mind. Now, when compared to the 285K, the 9950X 3D was just 3% slower, and my 285K data is up to date. It's also worth noting that when compared to the 9800X 3D, we're looking at a 77% performance boost. And then finally, when enabling the max PBO, we saw a tiny 3% performance boost, and then the power conservative eco mode reduced performance by 25%, and we'll look at power consumption there in a moment. As for the single core performance, that remains the same as what we've seen previously from the 9950X with 141 points, and the same performance was produced using PBO, while just a single point was dropped with the eco mode. And this means when compared to the 285K, the 9950X 3D was 6% slower for single core performance in this particular workload. Now, when it comes to power consumption, we measured 229 watts across the EPS 12 volt rails, so the same power draw as the 9950X and 7950X, and thanks to a negative offset PBO, did slightly reduce power consumption. The Eco mode, which saw performance drop by 25%, did manage to reduce power consumption by almost 60%, so the Eco mode is considerably more power efficient, as the name suggests. It's impressive to see that for the same power draw as the 9600X, you're getting 87% more performance in this test. Next up, we have the 7-zip file manager compression test, and here the 9950X 3D dominates, beating the 7950X 3D by a 7% margin and the 9950X by a 15% margin, which is also a similar margin that we see between the 9700X and 9800X 3D. Not only that, but using the Eco mode saw the 9950X 3D still able to match the 9950X, making it just 4% slower than the 285K, while sipping power. Then for decompression performance, the 9950X 3D is comparable to the 9950X and 7950X, making it 31% faster than the 285K. In fact, when limited to the Eco mode, the 9950X 3D is just 2% slower than the 285K, so AMD is crushing Intel in this workload. Moving on to the Blender results, the 9950X 3D again tops the charts, this time coming in just 4% faster than the 285K and 9950X. Enabling Eco mode kills performance, dropping the samples per minute to 202, an almost 30% reduction from stock, though that's roughly twice the performance of the 9600X for a similar power draw. The 9950X 3D is also a chart topper in Corona, beating Intel's 285K by a 13% margin, and the previous generation 7950X by a 20% margin. Enabling max PBO only boosted performance by a further 4%, but that did result in the best performance we've seen from a mainstream platform, at least to date. Photoshop doesn't take advantage of core-heavy CPUs very well, so the 9950X 3D doesn't really offer anything over the 9800X 3D in this example. In fact, out of the box it was slightly slower. Still, when compared to the 285K, the 9950X 3D was almost 20% faster, so a big margin there. Premiere Pro does a better job of utilizing the higher core count CPUs, though not nearly to the same degree as the 3D rendering tests. Anyway, the 9950X 3D was 5% slower than the 285K here, though it was able to match the 14900K when running the low-powered Eco mode. Okay, time for the gaming benchmarks, and we'll start with Star Wars Jedi Survivor. Here the 9950X 3D was able to match the 9800X 3D, which is a great result, though really to be expected given that the 7950X 3D matched the 7800X 3D. This does point to the 9950X 3D being a significantly better all-rounder, especially for those of you who also want high-end gaming performance for your workstation, as the 9950X 3D is 52% faster than the 285K here. The 7950X 3D and 7800X 3D were also comparable in The Last of Us Part 1, and the same is true of the 9950X 3D and 9800X 3D, with the dual CCD Zen 4 part allowing for 210 FPS, making it just 7% faster than the 285K in this example. Now, the Cyberpunk 2077 results are interesting. Here the 9950X 3D allowed for 216 FPS, making it just 1% slower than the 9800X 3D. So in other words, performance was much the same. And that's a great result because the 7950X 3D is 8% slower than the 7800X 3D, and we've seen a bit of this in the past where the dual CCD model can be anywhere from a bit slower to a lot slower for gaming, and AMD has been working to solve this, and it looks like they're finally getting there. Scheduling issues weren't a problem for the 7950X 3D and ACC, as here we can see it matched the 7800X 3D, and the same is true of the 9950X 3D, which was able to match or really even nudge ahead slightly of the 9800X 3D, delivering chart-topping results. This also meant that the 9950X 3D was an insane 77% faster than the 285K in this game. Remnant 2 is another game where previously we didn't see any scheduling issues, so the 9950X 3D performed as expected, delivering a few more frames than the 9800X 3D, making it 33% faster than the 285K. The 9950X 3D was a beast in Homeworld 3, despite slipping behind the 9800X 3D by a small 4% margin, but that's an excellent result given the 7950X 3D, which was a massive 25% slower than the 7800X 3D. And this also meant that the 9950X 3D was 52% faster than the 285K. The 7950X 3D had some frame pacing issues in A Plague Tale Requiem, and as a result ended up trailing the 7800X 3D by a 6% margin when comparing the average frame rate, and 20% slower for the 1% lows. The 9950X 3D, on the other hand, behaves like a 9800X 3D, delivering the same excellent performance, making it 58% faster than the 285K. By the way, I have gone back and retested the 285K, and sadly, in examples like this where the performance was horrible, Intel has been unable to improve upon this situation. The 7950X 3D was only slightly slower than the 7800X 3D in Counter-Strike 2, but whatever the issue was here, it's been cleared up with the 9950X 3D, which matched the 9800X 3D basically exactly, and this also made it 29% faster than the 285K. The previous generation CPUs didn't suffer any major scheduling issues in Starfield, so unsurprisingly the 9950X 3D performs like a 9800X 3D here, making it 11% faster than the 285K. Next up we have Space Marine 2, and here the 9950X 3D is delivering 9800X 3D-like performance, which is great news as the 7950X 3D was 10% slower than the 7800X 3D in this title. This also means when compared to the 285K, the 9950X 3D is 25% faster. The Hitman III results are really surprising because here the 9950X 3D is actually 6% faster than the 9800X 3D, allowing for 306 FPS, a 14% boost over the 285K. That's also a great result as the 7950X 3D was 4% slower than the 7800X 3D. Finally, we have Watch Dogs Legion, and here the 9950X 3D was 3% faster than the 9800X 3D, making it a massive 39% faster than the 285K, so overall excellent gaming performance from the 9950X 3D. Now, when it comes to power consumption, the 9950X 3D consumed 44% more power than the 9800X 3D in Cyberpunk 2077, and this saw it match the Core i9 12900K, consuming just 8% less power than the 285K. But let's look at power efficiency when factoring in the FPS results. Here we can see that in terms of power efficiency, the 9950X 3D is comparable to the 9600X and 7600X, making it 35% more power efficient than the 285K in this example. Still, it was 48% less efficient than the 9800X 3D, though that gap was reduced to 17% when using the Eco mode. Measuring power usage in The Last of Us Part 1 saw the 9950X 3D consume 32% more power than the 9800X 3D, but 14% less than the 285K. So let's see how that works out when calculating for efficiency. The 9950X 3D is comparable to the 5800X 3D or 7600X when it comes to power efficiency, making it around 30% less efficient than the 9800X 3D and 37% less efficient than the 7950X 3D. Still, when compared to the 285K, we're looking at an almost 20% improvement in efficiency. Okay, so here's a look at the 12-game average data, and really no surprises here. The 9950X 3D is a beast, taking out top spot, delivering basically the same performance as the class-leading 9800X 3D. Even in the Eco mode, it was on average 8% faster than the 7800X 3D and 31% faster than the 285K. Overall, we're only looking at a 1.4% performance boost from PBO, at least across the games we tested, but this improved power efficiency, so it might be worth looking into. Overall though, amazing performance and amazingly consistent performance for a dual CCD processor. It looks as though AMD has finally got there. Gigabyte made a big deal out of the X3D Turbo mode when they first added it to their BIOS, making some impressive claims about performance gains, though at the time no one really knew what it did. Since then we've learnt that it's mostly a useless feature that no one would really use, just given how impractical it is. In short, what it does is disable the second CCD entirely, along with SMT support, taking apart like the 9950X 3D from a 16-core 32-thread processor down to an 8-core 8-thread processor. Gigabyte is also tuning some of the memory timings for better gaming performance. So what all this does is ensure that the game is running on the CCD with the 3D V cache while removing SMT from the equation, which is a feature that can sometimes hurt gaming performance, though we found that overall, leaving it enabled is of net benefit. The major problem with this feature is that it can only be enabled within the BIOS, as in you have to completely reset the system every time you want to enable or disable it, and therefore it's not something that you can quickly or easily toggle on and off within Windows before and after launching a game, for example. If a toggle option was possible, then this would be an amazing and very practical feature, but sadly, that is not the case. With the X3D Turbo mode enabled, we saw a 3% improvement on average across the dozen games tested, with some really impressive uplifts seen in titles such as Homeworld III and Space Marine 2, but we also saw significant performance regressions in other titles such as Starfield and The Last of Us Part 1. Now, for those of you just interested in gaming, the 9950X3D doesn't make much sense from a cost perspective, given it costs $700 US and delivers very similar gaming performance to the much cheaper 9800X3D. Of course, if you don't care about cost, then there's really no reason not to get the 9950X3D over, say, the 9800X3D, as they should effectively deliver the same gaming performance. But if you care about value and are still seeking high-end performance, then the 9800X3D or even 7800X3D are going to make more sense. Still, for a higher core count CPU, the 9950X3D is really the best all-rounder solution, generally matching or beating the productivity performance of the Core Ultra 9 285K, while completely smashing it for gaming performance and value. Just quickly, G.Skill recently sent over their new Trident Z5 Neo RGB DDR5 6000 CL26 36 36 96 memory kit, so I thought why not see how it works with the 9950X3D. Of course, we're well aware that one of the key benefits of these 3D Vcache processors is that they're generally not particularly memory sensitive, so unsurprisingly we are seeing very little in the way of a performance uplift with the lower latency memory kit. And this is good news because 32GB CL30 kits can be had for under $100 US, so the memory component here is relatively affordable. So there you have it, the new Ryzen 9 9950X3D, and for me this one's an easy recommendation with very few caveats. I think it's fair to say that it has cemented itself as the best all-rounder for those of you who want the ultimate performance of both work and play. That said, if productivity is your focus, then there's a good chance the 9950X3D will be the best option outside of, like a super expensive Threadripper processor. In a workload like Cinebench, the 9950X3D and 285K were neck and neck, with the Ryzen processor consuming a little over 10% less power. I'd say in general, they're going to be quite competitive for productivity workloads, but of course, it's best to research the performance in the applications that you'll actually be using. Where things become dire for Intel is gaming. Man, I never thought I'd say that, but here we are with the 9950X3D offering on average 35% more performance, which is a mind-blowing margin and really unlike anything we've seen before when comparing AMD and Intel processors, certainly prior to the release of the 9800X3D. It does look as though AMD has been able to completely address the scheduling issues of their 3D Vcache-enabled dual CCD processors, at least based on the small sample of games I was able to test in time for this review. Of course, I'll have to look much more closely at a larger sample of games in future content, but for now I'd just suggest going around and looking at as many reviews as you can, because collectively they should cover a good number of games. But what all this looks to mean is buying a dual CCD processor with 3D Vcache technology is a far less dicey proposition for those of you that also like to game. Or at the very least, you no longer have to spend any time messing around with third-party applications in an effort to manually correct scheduling issues. The 9950X3D is by far the best dual CCD processor that we've seen from AMD yet. You know what they say, it just works, and extremely well. And with that, I am done with this review. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, all that sort of stuff. We'll probably have a big benchmark with the 9950X3D in a ton of games, just to see how that scheduling pans out when we test many more titles. But until then, we also have the join button on Patreon. If you want to become a Hardware Unboxed member, get access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, behind the scenes content, and Q&A stuff. But if not, that's perfectly fine, and I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.